Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video on YouTube to help you improve your chess game. I think this is my 251st video. Today I'd like to talk about an idea called piece coordination. And when I use the word piece, I'm using the definition of piece the same way we would say in the opening, the main goal is to activate all your pieces. And that is the non-pawns. I'm not going to talk about coordinating pawns today. Pawn structure and how to move your pawns is a whole different thing. I'd like to just talk about the other pieces. Okay, I wrote a book when I was 23 years old called Elements of Positional Evaluation. And the idea of the book was to talk about how you know when your pieces are strong or weak or whether they work together or not. It wasn't really about the evaluation of an entire position, but more the evaluation of the individual pieces of the position. And I mentioned what I called the real elements. And the real elements that I listed were mobility, flexibility, vulnerability, center control, piece coordination, time, speed. So those are the main elements that you would use to figure out how good your pieces are. Not necessarily the whole position, which includes everything, the pawns, where everything's placed. It would be like, is that a good knight? Is that a good bishop? Does it work well with the other pieces? So this time we're going to talk about just one of those elements, which is coordination. Now, coordination in chess obviously means something very similar to what it would mean in English, which would mean how well do the pieces work together. And let's start out by talking about controlling squares. One of the main things that pieces do is control squares. When I ask, why is a queen worth more than a rook? The answer is easy, because it can also move diagonally like a bishop, so it can control more squares. It can move to more squares, so it has more mobility. It has usually more activity. It has more things that it can do. It can threaten more things. So controlling more squares is important. Let's start out by putting the two white knights on the squares that you're often told to develop your knights in the opening, c3 and f3. And let's start circling the squares that they're controlling. The knight on c3 is attacking the following squares: d4, c5, b5, a4. Okay, now let's do the same thing with the knight on f3. d4, d2, e1, g1, h2, h4, g5, e5. If we look at those squares, you should notice a couple things. One is, that's a lot of squares. The two knights are controlling 16 different squares. Why 16? Well, each knight can move to 8 places, and there's no overlap. There's no interference between the knights. There's no square that they're controlling twice. And that's good. That gives them the maximum capability to control the squares. So in that sense, the fact that the two knights are not attacking the same square, it actually means they coordinate well together, because the more that you can control, the better your pieces work together. When the knights interfere with each other and they're controlling the same squares, then they're not quite as strong. So for instance, if we put the knight on f3 on, let's say, e2, now the knights are guarding each other. Well, that's great if one of those knights is attacked or pinned. Of course, you want to make sure the knights are safe. But otherwise, if the knights are both fairly safe, these knights are not as effective. If we now look at the square c3 and the square e2, they're guarding each other, but they're not controlling as many squares. And of course, the knight on e2, some of the 8 squares it's controlling are off the board, so it really only controls 6. So when these knights attack each other or guard each other like this, it could be good for safety, but it actually could be bad for safety. If the knights are not needed to guard each other, and they're needed to guard other squares, then they're not doing as good a job when they're controlling the squares that each other are on. So Larry Kaufman has a discussion about this when he wrote his famous article that's on my website. Larry gave me permission to put up his article, which is well, let me pull it up on the show. Okay, this is Larry's famous article, The Evaluation of Material Imbalances. It won the award in 1999 for Best Instruction, and it still holds up to today, where Larry looked at a few 100 million positions to take the value of the pieces. And, Larry talks about all kinds of different things on what make pieces strong. But if we go back to the board again, one of the things he talked about was what he calls redundant pieces. Redundant pieces are pieces that kind of move the same way, that get in each other's way. So here the 2 knights are redundant. What other pieces can be redundant? Well, for instance, rooks can be redundant. At the start of the game when you castle your rooks, let's put the rooks on the board. Alright, these rooks are guarding each other. Same thing as that they are with the knights. If the rooks need to guard each other, if the back rank is weak, if the rooks are under attack, then it's good to have the rooks guarding each other. But other than that, the rooks take away each other's squares. The rook on d1 can only move over to e1 or recapture on f1, but he can't move to g1 or h1. The rook on f1 can move to e1 or recapture on d1, but can't move to c1, b1, or a1. So the total number of squares that the rooks are attacking are less than the maximum number. If I move my rook on d1 to d2, so they're not guarding each other, now each rook is guarding 14 squares, but the only 2 that are redundant here are f2 and d1. So if we look at the number of different squares that they're guarding, each rook is guarding 14. How many new squares is the other rook guarding? Well, the one on f1, there's the 14. So now how many new squares is the one on d2 guarding? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that makes sense. Each one had 14, but there were 2 redundant squares. 14 plus 14 minus 2 is 26. So these rooks are attacking kind of the maximum number of squares they can attack on an empty board. It's always good to start with an empty board and get the potential for the piece, and then translate that into a real board where things are in the way and figuring out how much that affects the piece. So here we're talking about the potential of the pieces, and here the rooks are guarding 26. If we count it when the rook was on d1, now neither rook is hitting 14. The rook on d1 has 7 this way and 4 this way, which is 11, and the other rook has 7 and 3, which is 10. 11 and 10 is 21. 21 is less than 26. So the rooks are not as effective in hitting all the squares when you have them guarding each other like this. So Larry Kaufman calls this idea redundant pieces, redundant knights, redundant rooks. And he says pieces are redundant when they're in each other's way like that. And he said pieces are more powerful when they're not. And he says this is one of the reasons why the bishop pair is so strong. The bishop pair, by the way, does not mean that you have 2 bishops. The bishop pair is really short for a longer phrase, which is the advantage of the bishop pair. And the advantage of the bishop pair is just like saying your parents, have the advantage over your friend Tommy because your parents are rich. Well, that means Tommy's parents are not rich. The advantage of the bishop pair means you've got the 2 bishops and he doesn't. So when one side has 2 bishops and the other doesn't, you have the advantage of the bishop pair, but we don't say all those syllables, the advantage of the bishop pair, we just say bishop pair. And Larry Kaufman said in his report that one of the reasons why the bishop pair is so powerful is they're never redundant. They never get in each other's way. They're always attacking different pieces, different squares. They never can get in each other's way. The only way you could have redundant bishops is if you promote a pawn and then have 2 bishops of the same color. Now, can the bishops be redundant with other pieces? Sure. Rooks and bishops can both be redundant with queens. If the queen gets on the diagonal, then the bishop will be blocking the queen and the queen's guarding the bishop. And you might say, but that could be good. That's a battery. A battery is when you move 2 long-range pieces on the same line. A queen and a rook on the same line, or a queen and the bishop on the same line. You can even think of both rooks of being on the same line as being a battery. And you say, well, batteries are good. Batteries can break things down. You could checkmate people on dark squares. So for instance, let's put a battery over here. And let's create some sort of weak square complex here for black. And you say, all right, well, it's good to have my queen and my bishop like this. I can bring my queen into g7 or maybe to h8 and checkmate him. So isn't that good? And the answer is, well, in this position, certainly, where black has weak dark squares around your king and you're managing to get your queen and your bishop on the same diagonal and put them up there, then this is really good. But what if we have a completely random position where pieces are just normally placed and your opponent doesn't have such a weak square complex that you can somehow maneuver to create? So what Larry said is, yes, of course this is true, but this is more the exception than the rule. Meaning that most positions aren't the same where the bishop and the queen would be able to attack that square so well. Ironically, if we attack that square, this way, where we put the queen where it's not attacking the same squares as the bishop, yes, it's true, of course, you can push the pawn here, and we have to look at the individual parts of the position and what people can do, but I purposely didn't put all the rest of the pieces on the board. We don't know what black could do to really defend here. But notice the queen and the bishop are less redundant here. The queen is moving on the white squares on the diagonal, and he's on a line that doesn't block the bishop, so both pieces are getting close to their maximum kind of power here, rather than that they would when they're on the same line. Same thing with the rooks. We always hear that doubling rooks is a good thing, and if there's only one open file on the board, let's create one open file on the board. We'll put a bunch of pawns on all the files except the E file. And the rooks are back here on the first rank. Well, it makes a lot of sense to put your rook on E1, then move your rook up somewhere, then move your rook over, double your rooks, and then try to penetrate to the other side of the board. Yes, there's only one open file, and putting the rooks there is redundant, but it puts them on the open file, which is better than putting them on the closed files. But if all the lines were open, then that might not be the best way to put your rooks. If we had two lines open like this, yes, the two rooks here might be great if they're pinning a piece to a king or doing something like that or trying to get down there. But they might be better by having the rooks like this, where they're controlling the D and the E files, and they might be even better like this. Again, assuming there's no safety issue with the rooks being attacked, they can be better like that, and maybe even better when we put the rook over here where it's not on the lines with the pawns. Now we're getting a lot more mobility, which, as I said, a queen's worth more than a rook because it has more mobility. When you give your pieces more mobility, they get more power. So here, the rooks actually coordinate really well together, even though they're not guarding each other. Again, I can't stress too much and too importantly that when you're talking about safety issues, well, then you want your pieces guarded. You want them even overprotected. When we're just talking about making them powerful, then maybe that's not the best idea. Another very, very famous way to double up your rooks is doubled rooks on the 7th rank. This can be monstrously strong in many, many situations. One of the reasons why it's monstrously strong is all the enemy pawns initiate on that square, so they can't guard each other there. If we put the black pawns over there, they could fall like, dominoes here on the 7th rank when the rooks both get down there and start attacking them multiple times with the rooks guarding each other. And even when the pawns start moving up, the rooks can not only attack other pawns, but they can get behind the pawns, and the pawns can't easily guard each other. So rooks on the 7th rank. The other reason why rooks on the 7th rank are really strong is kings usually start on the 8th rank. I shouldn't say usually. Always start on the 8th rank. They usually are still on the 8th rank for a long time in the game. And if your rooks can cut off a king like this, not only can you create threats on the 7th rank, but you make him guard the 8th rank because the threat to move one of the rooks to the 8th rank and checkmate becomes strong. So the multiple issues here really start to add up. We have the famous mating pattern where if there's a rook on f8, you play check, here, check, mate. That's one of those 2000 Dvoretsky patterns that he says you should memorize. And even if the rook, black rook, is over here, if we could just get any one piece guarding any of these squares, then all of a sudden we have the possibility for mating patterns. For instance, let's say we move a pawn up here, like this. All right, now we could play something like rook checks, king here, rook checks, king here, rook checks, king here, rook mates. Now, could he have done something different by moving to the middle? Sure. In fact, he should. In this position, he should go here to avoid that. But again, white will play here and threaten mate on rook h8, and if black doesn't have anything better, we're assuming black has some other pieces around that he can't stop him with, then now if he goes back, we can mate him in two with rook checks, king here, rook here. Because it's all because that pawn got to h6. So sure, the rooks on the 7th rank can coordinate really well in these kind of mating attacks, but they are redundant rooks. And this is more the point of the video and the point of this example is that this is more the exception than the rule. Double rooks on the 7th rank are almost always really good, but you know, if you double your rooks somewhere else, you know, doubling your rooks on the 2nd rank instead, where all your pawns are, this should be obvious that this isn't necessarily the best use of the rooks here, because now the other things on the line are not targets, they're things that are interfering with the mobility of your pieces. This leads to a very interesting point, which is, suppose you're in a random endgame. Let's pick a random pawn position here. Let's say king here, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here, you know, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here. We'll give white the same kind of pawns. Maybe he'll have pawns on slightly different files. Okay, and we'll give each side a king. And now we'll give each side two pieces that aren't doing much at the moment. Let's say a queen here and a knight here, and black has a queen c7, and he has a bishop on f8. Okay, now here all the pawns aren't fixed, which is good for the bishop, and bishops are a little better than knights in the endgame. Which endgame side would you rather have? Would you rather have white here or black? It's obviously pretty close. It's not going to be a giant difference. Let's ask Stockfish to analyze it and see what he thinks. All right, Stockfish is looking, and he says it's very close. He's at 0-0-0 at the moment. And of course, if he looks a million moves ahead and he sees that neither side can win, he's going to go to 0-0-0. And for a while, he was showing that white was a little better. All right, so he thinks the flexibility of the bishop and the knight are kind of canceling here. Let's fix a couple pawns and see if he thinks the same thing. Let's fix the pawns on white squares because we don't want to block the bishop. So let's put a pawn on f5, pawn on e6, and let's put a white pawn on f4, and well, this pawn is backwards, so let's put a white pawn in the way here. Let's say this pawn is here. All right, let's see what Stockfish thinks now. Stockfish thinks that helped black a little bit since the white pawns are now targets. Interesting. All right, well, that belies what I was trying to tell you, but that's okay. Stockfish likes to make me look silly sometimes. But generally, if you have a random position, and I'll go back to something more random here. We'll put an extra pawn on the board now. Something like this. When you have a random position like this, a queen and a knight is usually a little better than a queen and a bishop. Stockfish says, yeah, maybe not, but not here. Stockfish says 0-0-0. So I said Stockfishes like to make me look bad. But if you play over lots of Grandmaster games where you have a lot of, I shouldn't say random pawn structures, but a lot of different pawn structures that occur in Grandmaster games, and you get into openings, and you read the annotations of the authors, a queen and a knight is usually a little bit better than a queen and a bishop. Sure, if a queen and a bishop can get on a diagonal and form a battery that could threaten the checkmate, that's a monstrously strong idea. But other than that, the queen and the knight coordinate better. Why is that true? Well, it's the same reason that Grandmaster Kaufman talked about in that article I showed you, the evaluation of material imbalances earlier. Let's take all the pieces off the board here. Let's just look at the queen and the knight. Queen and a knight, when they're close to each other, they're guarding different squares, and the fact that they move differently helps. Here the knight's guarding some of the squares, the same squares as the queen. And here the queen is in the way of the knight, so maybe it's better to put the queen on a different square. Maybe I should put the queen over here. But we're seeing that they don't get in each other's way. The knight jumps over things, so in that sense, the queen can never block the knight. No matter where you put the queen, if you move the queen close, that doesn't stop the knight from jumping around it. The queen can't block the knight like the queen can block the bishop. Have you ever noticed in a game, let's say you are being attacked by an enemy queen. Let's make it a white king. Let's say you're being attacked by an enemy queen. And he's near your king, but he's the only piece near your king. And all you have to guard your king is a knight. And you're like, oh no, queens are worth 9, knights are worth 3. That's the Reinfeld values. If we go by more sophisticated values like Larry has in that article, queens are worth like 10, knights are worth maybe 3.5. But obviously the queen's worth way more than the knight, and the poor knight's trying to guard the king. Well, you might think, this knight has no chance against this queen. Well, it's true if we're looking for offense, but if we're looking for defense, the knight's not so bad. Look at all the checks this queen has on this square. He could check on e3, but the king is guarding that. He could check on g3, but the king's guarding that. He could check on d4, but the knight's guarding that. He could check on h4, but the knight's guarding that. He could check on h2, but the knight's guarding that. He could check on d2, and the knight's guarding that. So all of a sudden, the queen has no safe checks against the king. Amazing. Now you might say, well, Dan, you cheated. You put the queen and the knight exactly where you knew it would work. Put the queen somewhere else. I'm like, okay, well, let's pick any square on the king side here. We could have picked h3. All right, here we go again. Queen f1, can't do it because the king's guarding it. Queen g2, can't do it, the king's guarding it. Queen h2, can't do it, the king's guarding it. Queen h4, can't do it, the knight's guarding it. Sorry, I said king on h2. Queen g3, can't do it, the king's guarding it. There are no safe checks again. Now, sure, if we put the queen far enough away on the queen side, like queen a8, well, now he's got a couple checks from a distance. He could play queen a7. He could play queen a2, and the knight can't do anything about them right away. But the king's in no danger. A king's in a lot more danger when the queen is close to it and guarding a lot of squares. For instance, suppose your king gets checked. Again, this is a coordination issue. If your king gets checked, let's say put the king on g1. If the queen could manage to check you on a square like, f2 and be guarded by something, let's say a pawn, then all he needs is a knight or a rook or a bishop to guard one more square and mate you. Because the queen's guarding so many squares. Let's move the king out toward the middle, and that's still going to be true. Let's say a queen attacks you from this square, and he's guarded. Then all he has to do is have a piece guarding these two squares. Maybe a rook on a1 or something. So a queen can guard a lot of squares around a king and take away a whole bunch of the squares. So when queens get near kings, it's very dangerous. But it's a great relief a lot of times when a knight is near a king, because the knight and the king coordinate really well against the queen, partly because the knight doesn't move like a queen, and it can cover different squares than the way the queen's moving. That's not the only reason, of course, but that's part of the issue. So what we're trying to get across is when pieces move differently and they're in the same area, they can be very powerful. So, for instance, as I said, if black is the one attacking with a knight instead of defending against the knight, this knight is going to be really helpful with the queen over here. Let's put a knight somewhere. All right, so where would the king go here? If the king goes to, let's say, g2, then queen f3 check. If he goes to g1, we get the knight into the attack. I guess he would go over here. And then black's going to try to check the king and try to get the knight into the attack. He could also bring the knight up and just threaten the checkmate. Or maybe he could check, and when the king goes here, he can start to get the knight to come in. The knight and the queen coordinate very well. Now, obviously, if the king's out in the middle and we have a black rook, that's even better, because the rook covers so many more squares than the knight. But the knight and the queen are a really good combination, and the knight's not blocked by pawns. He can jump right over where the pawns are. So if there's a white pawn somewhere, and there's a black bishop, we're assuming that, let's say that pawn is guarded, then the bishop can't hit the squares on the other side, but knights are not so bothered because they just jump over things. Now here, of course, the knight can't take the pawn either, but he could jump here, or if the knight's like, let's put it somewhere like here, where the pawn is on one of the squares, he's still attacking the squares on the other side. So knights are bothered less by pawns than bishops are. The reason why the reason why we say things like a bad bishop is a bishop that's usually blocked by its own pawns that are immobile. So for instance here, we can create a bad bishop by blocking all the pawns. Now usually you hear a lot about bad bishops, but you don't hear as much about bad knights. Well, is it possible the knight could be trapped too? Yeah, we could put a knight over here. If he's on h1, now he's in big trouble. But if he's on g2, where a bishop is trapped, the knight can get back in the game. The knight can get around things. Also, if the knight has to, he can help sacrifice. Let's say you're trying to win two of those pawns for a piece. Knight takes, pawn takes, knight takes. The knight can break out by sacrificing. This bishop can't even sacrifice. He can't do anything. So you hear a lot about bad bishops, but you don't hear too much about bad knights. So we're outside the scope of the video now because we're not really supposed to be talking about coordinating with the pawns. But the bishop has a lot to do with how the pawns are situated. The knights do too, but slightly less. Every piece has a lot to do with how the pawns are coordinated. And we want to stop when we start talking about the pawns, because today we were talking about piece coordination. And we haven't covered everything. But next time you play over a Grandmaster game, if you're doing the kind of homework that I give to my students, like reading lots of annotated game collections, instructive anthologies, like Logical Chess Move by Move, or my book, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book, which I highly recommend, not because I want to make money, because I think it's one of my best books, and I think you really learn a lot from it. The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book. When you're playing over Grandmaster games, which my book is not, of course, watch how they coordinate their pieces. They don't just put them on random squares where, they might be doing something. They try to put them on squares where what they can do and what the other pieces can do work together. And that doesn't necessarily mean guard each other. It doesn't necessarily mean hit the same squares. It might mean hit different squares. Sometimes hitting the same square is good if that's a focal point of your attack. You want all your pieces to attack that pawn on g7. So you put your rooks over here. You put your bishop over here. You get your queen up to h6. And, everybody's trying to hit this focal point on g7. Well, okay, these pieces are really well coordinated. If you're just trying to control the whole board or make inroads to where your army is more powerful than his army, sometimes having all your pieces attack the same squares reduces their efficiency and not gains it. And people have a tendency to think in terms of safety and tactics, where you want things to all concentrate on one square. But sometimes if you're just talking about positional play and controlling the board so that later you can get the tactics, sometimes it's better to have your pieces where they're not all controlling the same square. And again, this is a lot to do with why at the start of the game we tell people to develop the knights to like f3 and c3. If instead you develop your knight to f3 and you develop your other knight to d2, yes, they're safe and they're guarding each other, and that could be helpful in certain openings. But in general, this knight on d2 is much weaker than it is on c3, partly because the other knight is in its way. It's redundant. And that's where we started, and that's where we're going to finish. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video, and you tell other people about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. And you can like the video or subscribe to the channel. See you next time. Bye.